Red Willow Basin, northern Wyoming, late November 1951. The wind cut across the open ground like a blade, steady and cold. On that slope, Benjamin Barlow dragged curved steel panels uphill, one by one. They were Quonset ribs, war surplus, bent metal meant for storage. Barlow bolted them together anyway, arch by arch, until a steel shell rose over his log cabin. A second skin, not insulation, a shield. Down at Windlass Mercantile, laughter came easy. Men leaned on the counter and shook their heads. "He's wrapping his house like warehouse stock," one said. "Steel sweats. He'll rot it out." Barlow did not answer. He tightened bolts. He checked spacing. He worked into the wind. The basin watched, amused, as if winter could be negotiated. It could not. If you want proven frontier heating ideas, the kind that mattered when lives depended on it, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. This story is proof that the coldest places breed the smartest solutions. The wind kept coming, and the storms that followed would not care who laughed first. People assumed a good cabin failed only from weak walls or thin logs. If the fire burned hot enough, the thinking went, warmth would follow, but winter kept proving otherwise. Well-built cabins bled heat faster the stove could make it. Barlow was not fighting cold with more wood. He was hunting the thief that stole heat in motion. Not thicker walls, not bigger fires. Wind. Stop the wind at the surface, and heat stays put. Miss that, and no amount of fuel saves you. This is frontier logic in winter. Benjamin Barlow lived far enough from town that laughter reached him late, if at all. His cabin sat where the basin tilted upward, and the wind never had to ask permission. He chose that ground because it had timber, stone, and space to work. The cabin itself was built the way good cabins were built. Fieldstone footings set below frost line. Hand-notched logs pulled tight at the corners. A steep roof pitched to shed snow before weight could gather. Nothing about it was careless. Nothing about it was rushed. By frontier standards, it was solid work, done by a man who expected to live with the results. The winter before had tested it anyway. Wind found the seams. It slipped through log joints, pressed cold against the walls, and pulled warmth out faster than the stove could replace it. The fire burned steady, but the rooms never settled. Barlow's children did their lessons at the table, wearing gloves. Their breath fogged the air when the fire dipped. Ink stiffened. Fingers went numb before pages were filled. At night, the house demanded attention. Barlow rose from bed to feed the stove, bank coals, check the draft, then rose again hours later to do it all over. Martha did not complain, but she watched the walls. Each morning she brushed frost from the inside boards and wondered what the neighbors would say if they knew how cold it stayed. Barlow said little. He split wood, stacked it under cover, and kept records the way men did when fuel meant survival. Dates, temperatures, how often the stove was fed. The pattern was clear. The more wood he burned, the faster the heat disappeared. The problem was not effort. The problem was not pride. The wind did not care how carefully a cabin was built. It stripped heat from the surface and carried it away, hour after hour, without rest. At Windlass Mercantile, the advice came freely. Burn hotter. Add another course of logs. Just keep the fire going. Someone said what many were thinking. Steel conducts cold faster than wood. Wrapping a cabin in metal is suicide. Barlow heard versions of that line more than once. He did not argue with it. Not yet. He knew the cabin was not failing from weak hands or poor judgment. It was failing because physics does not respect reputation. Each night the wind returned to teach the same lesson, and each morning Barlow wrote the numbers down, quiet and exact, until the truth stopped being personal and became mechanical. That understanding did not come from books or neighbors' advice. It came from years before, in a different kind of cold, when Barlow worked maintenance on wartime rail lines far from shelter. Back then, his job was keeping rolling stock moving through snow and crosswind. He learned quickly that air itself was not the enemy. Wind was. Standing still, cold could be managed. Moving fast, it stripped heat like a file on metal. He had watched exposed steel lose warmth in minutes while protected sections stayed workable, not because the steel was better, but because the wind never reached it. Some freight cars had narrow buffer corridors built into their frames. They were not insulated in the modern sense. They were simply shielded. Wind hit the outer skin, slowed, bent away, and never touched the inner surface. Those cars stayed warmer with less effort. The lesson was blunt and unforgiving. Learned with cracked knuckles and frozen tools, Barlow carried that memory with him long after the war ended. He remembered metal humming under pressure, remembered how wind could steal heat faster than cold ever could. Out on his Wyoming slope, watching gusts rake across his cabin walls, the connection became unavoidable. The enemy was not winter itself. It was the moment wind touched wood and pulled warmth away. That realization narrowed his choices fast. If the wind was the thief, then it had to be stopped before it reached the cabin walls. Not slowed, not fought inside, stopped outside. Barlow drove south to Casper and walked the surplus yard alone. Between stacked crates and rusted machinery, he found what he was looking for: curved steel panels from a dismantled Quonset structure. Scarred but sound, they were not cheap, enough to claim the last of his war bonds and what little he'd saved from his railroad days. He bought them anyway. Hauling them back required 3 trips on a borrowed flatbed, a favor called in from the only man in the basin who still owed him one. Neighbors slowed when they passed the slope. No one needed to ask what he was doing. The steel arches told the story well enough. He set Douglas fir posts, 2 by 8, around the cabin perimeter, each one placed carefully, spaced to hold a shell that would never touch the wood it protected. He worked from first light until his hands were too numb to grip a wrench, driven by the memory of his children doing lessons in their gloves. The genius of the Quonset was its brutal repetition. Once the first arch was set, the rest followed a rhythm lift, a line, bolt. It was a race against the calendar, a fight against the memory of the winter before. The shell rose slowly, 22 feet wide, 40 feet long, curved ribs bolted together, arcing over the roofline like a second sky. Between steel and log, Barlow left 18 inches of open space. Not insulation, not storage, a dead zone where air could not run. He framed an entry with 2 doors, one inside the other. An airlock, simple and deliberate, so wind would have to stop before it could enter. The chimney passed through both layers with a double collar. Clearances were measured twice. Heat had a path out. Wind did not have a path in. 5 vents were cut low and high along the shell, with a ridge baffle above, enough breathing to release moisture, not enough to create draft. Slow exchange, not flow. Snow started early that year. It rattled against the steel as he worked, light at first, then heavier, reminding him that time was not generous. Martha watched from the doorway more than once. From some angles, the cabin looked swallowed, wrapped in metal like a cocoon that did not belong on a homestead. She said what he already knew. People are going to talk. Barlow tightened a bolt and did not look up. We don't live on their words. At the mercantile, questions took shape as warnings. Steel sweats. Moisture rots wood. Snow loads crush roofs. Everyone knew that. No one waited for answers. The objections traveled faster than explanations ever do. Out on the slope, Barlow kept building. He checked spacing with a level. He sealed seams. He listened to the sound of wind hitting steel and sliding away. Inside the dark buffer corridor, the air was still, quiet in a way the cabin had never been. By the time the last panel went on, the shell stood complete. Strange, unfamiliar, impossible to ignore. Martha stepped into the narrow space between steel and log and felt the difference. No draft, no bite, just cold held at a distance. She understood then what the choice meant. They were trading approval for time, comfort for survival. The wind did not care what it looked like, and winter was already on its way. The first real cold settled in quietly. Warm air rose from the cabin walls and met the steel skin above, and in a few places it slowed, cooled, and turned into moisture. One morning, Barlow noticed the smell before he saw it. Damp wood, faint, but wrong. He followed it into the buffer corridor and found a thin line of condensation clinging to the lower curve of steel. For a moment, the mercantile jokes felt close. Steel sweats. Sweat rots wood. The words had weight now. Barlow did not argue with them. He listened to what the structure was telling him. The vents were adjusted first, opened slightly on the leeward side, choked down on the windward face. Enough exchange to move moisture, not enough to pull heat. At the ridge, he reworked the baffle, angled it so rising air would slow and turn before escaping, forcing droplets to fall instead of riding the flow. At the base of the steel shell, he added a narrow drip edge. Nothing fancy, just a small channel to catch condensation and guide it outward, away from the wood. Where moisture collected most, he set a simple trap, a low point where water could gather and drain instead of spreading. The wind tested each change. It pushed, shifted, and returned from new angles as the days passed. Barlow checked the corridor every morning, then again at night. He ran a bare hand along the steel, felt for cold streaks, listened for drafts that did not belong. The damp smell faded. The wood dried back out. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No sudden warmth. No celebration. Just a quiet correction holding. The shell had not failed. It had needed tuning. That was the difference between an idea and a working system. One survived first contact with reality by changing. Barlow stood in the narrow corridor, breath steady, and knew how close the margin had been. If he was wrong, they would not just freeze. They would lose the house itself. The wind pressed on, indifferent, and the steel, now adjusted, pressed back. Heat leaves a cabin in three ways. It moves through materials, it radiates outward, and it is carried off by moving air. In windy country, that last one does the most damage. Convection is the thief that never sleeps. When wind scrapes a wall, it strips warmth directly from the surface, faster than any stove can replace it. Barlow did not try to fight that with thicker logs. He built a place where air could not run. The curved steel shell took the first hit. Wind struck it at speed, bent upward, and slid over the roof instead of grinding against wood. Behind that shell sat an 18-inch buffer. Air trapped there had no reason to move, and still air does not carry heat away. Inside that quiet zone, the cabin walls stopped bleeding warmth. They held what the fire gave them, instead of surrendering it to motion. The baffle at the ridge mattered just as much. Moist air rose, slowed, turned, and left gradually, without pulling heat along with it. Steel does conduct cold faster than wood. That much was true. But the steel never touched the cabin. It took the wind instead. Everything else followed from that. If the wind never reached the wall stayed warm. Barlow's goal was simple and measurable. Keep the inside above 60 degrees, while the air outside dropped below zero. The basin winds were known to gust past 70 miles an hour. If the shell could break that force, the cabin would not need to fight it. Nature would decide whether that logic held. Word traveled faster than explanations ever do. By the time the shell was fully buttoned up, most people in Red Willow Basin had already decided what it meant. Harold Finch drove up first. As the owner of the local sawmill, he had built more cabins than most men would see in a lifetime, and he walked the structure with a careful eye. He looked at the curve of the steel and shook his head. "Snow load," he said. "Ice buildup. Steel turning the place into a cold sink once the temperature dropped hard." He was not mocking. He was warning, the way craftsmen do when experience tells them something feels wrong. Down at Windlass Mercantile, the tone was looser. Men laughed and gave the thing a name that stuck: the steel cocoon. They said Barlow was hiding from winter instead of facing it like everyone else. They said fear made people do strange things when the cold came early. Thomas Reed arrived next, clipboard in hand. He circled the shell slowly, noted the vents, the spacing, the chimney collar. "This isn't in any agricultural manual I've seen," he said. He warned about condensation, about trapped moisture, about systems that looked clever until rot showed up in spring. Barlow listened. He nodded once. He went back to checking the vents. The hardest visit came without warning. Bruce Barlow pulled up one afternoon and stood in the snow without speaking for a long moment. Bruce was a builder by trade, respected, steady, known for work that lasted. If anyone understood what a proper cabin was supposed to look like, it was him. "This looks like you don't trust your own work," Bruce finally said. "Like you built something solid, then panicked and hid it inside steel. That cut deeper than the rest. It wasn't about moisture or snow load. It was about pride. People could laugh, authorities could doubt. But hearing that he had lost faith in his own hands landed heavy. Barlow did not defend himself. He did not explain dead air or wind stripping. He tightened bolts along the leeward side. He adjusted a vent. He shoveled snow away from the shell's base so meltwater would not pool. Bruce watched in silence, waiting for an argument that never came. None did. The accusations hung in the cold air, unanswered. Steel cocoon, running from winter, afraid to trust his own skill. Barlow kept working, and the wind kept circling the shell, testing it from every angle. Alone on that slope, surrounded by doubt, he let the structure speak for him. Early January 1952 brought the warning first. A low voice on the weather line, falling pressure, wind stacking up beyond the basin walls. Then it arrived. The gusts came hard and uneven, hammering the slope at 70 miles an hour. Snow erased distance. Whiteout swallowed fence lines, trees, and direction in a matter of minutes. This was the kind of storm that exposed every weakness. Wind forced itself through cracks. Snow drifted against doors until they would not open. Chimneys iced over. Draft collapsed. Smoke pushed back into rooms. Across the basin, lights went out one by one. A storage shed roof failed under load. Drifts sealed a lane and trapped a family inside their own yard. Barlow closed the outer door of the airlock and latched it tight. The wind hit steel and rang it like a drum, deep and hollow. Inside, he moved by habit. He checked the inner door seal. He cleared the chimney collar where it pierced the shell, knocking ice loose before it could thicken. The curved steel skin took the first blow. Wind struck it, rose, and slid away over the arch instead of driving straight into a wall. Snow tried to stack against the base. The shell's shape broke the drift and sent it spilling outward instead of piling high. Inside the buffer corridor, the air stayed still. No rush, no pull. Just quiet pressure held at bay. Martha kept the children close. Each gust rattled the shell, and with it came the reminder that nothing stood between them and the storm except design and judgment. Barlow listened to the structure, the rhythm of the wind, the change in tone when a gust found a new angle. He adjusted nothing that did not need it. Every bolt, every vent setting had been placed for this moment. Outside, the basin disappeared. No road, no help, no chance of leaving if something failed. This was the test. No argument could delay. No advice mattered now. No reputation counted. Only what stood could speak. Hour after hour, the storm pressed in. Steel rang. Snow slid. Wind searched for purchase and found none. Inside, the fire burned steady. The walls held their warmth instead of surrendering it to motion. The airlock did its work. Even when snow packed hard against the outer door, the inner space remained clear. Barlow stood once more in the narrow corridor, hand against steel, feeling vibration but no draft. The system was holding. The storm did not pause. It did not ask permission or offer mercy. It simply tested everything it touched. By the second day, the storm had not moved on. The wind still roared across the basin, and snow continued to drift in slow, relentless waves. That was when people began to notice what was missing. Other cabins pumped thick smoke without pause, chimneys working hard just to stay ahead of the cold. Barlow's place did not. A thin line rose, steady and calm, like an ordinary winter afternoon. There were no frantic tracks in the yard, no worn path running from door to woodpile and back again every hour. A neighbor passing on snowshoes slowed and looked twice. The shell stood quiet, half buried, doing its work without announcement. Inside, the air stayed even. Martha watched her child sit at the table, sleeves rolled up, pencil moving across paper with bare hands. No shivering, no breath, hanging white in the room. The wind still howled outside, but something about that house was no longer behaving the way it was supposed to. And once people see that, they do not forget it. Harold Finch came up the slope with a bundle of split pine strapped to his sled. He had told himself it was a courtesy, the kind men extended when storms dragged on longer than expected. He expected to find a house burning through fuel, a family huddled close to the stove, eyes tired from broken sleep. Barlow opened the outer door and stepped back. When Finch crossed the airlock threshold, the change hit him all at once. The cold fell away. Not the blast of an overheated room, but the steady warmth of a place that had been holding it for hours. Finch stopped without meaning to. He took off his gloves slowly, as if testing whether the feeling would vanish. No one was pressed up against the stove. The fire burned low and clean, doing its job without being fed every few minutes. Martha moved through the room at a normal pace. She poured coffee without rushing, without the tight efficiency that comes from working in the cold. The children sat nearby, calm, unbundled, the way people sit when the temperature is no longer the main concern. The room was warm enough to forget about. Finch looked at the walls, then at the ceiling. He waited for the draft that never came. Barlow said little. He opened the inner door and stepped into the narrow buffer corridor, motioning Finch to follow. The air there was cool but still. No rush, no pull, just quiet space doing its work. Barlow pointed once, at the gap, at the vents, at the baffle near the ridge. "The wind never touches the wall," he said. That was all. Finch stood in silence. The questions he had carried up the hill had nowhere to land. He looked again at the stove, at the relaxed posture of the room, at the simple fact of people living instead of enduring. The bundle of wood remained on the sled, untouched. For the first time since the shell went up, Finch did not shake his head. He did not argue. He just stood there, feeling the truth settle in. The wind eased just enough for travel, and Thomas Reed took the opportunity. He arrived with a calibrated thermometer in a leather case, the kind used when numbers had to end arguments. Reed did not hurry. He let the instrument settle in each corner of the room, away from the stove, then closer to the north wall where cold usually showed first. He wrote the readings down without comment. Outside, the air still sat deep below zero. Inside, the needle held steady above 60. He checked fuel next. The woodpile told its own story, smaller than it should have been, if the fire had been fighting all night. Harold Finch stood nearby and watched the process in silence. There was nothing to add, nothing to challenge. Reed closed his notebook and looked at Barlow. "I misjudged the conditions," he said. "The wind was the thief." Barlow nodded once. The numbers had spoken well enough on their own. From that moment on, the argument was over. The storm returned one last time after midnight. Not louder, but smarter. The wind shifted direction and began stacking snow where it had not before. Drifts formed like walls. They pressed against doors, buried steps, and sealed cabins from the outside in. Across the basin, trouble spread fast. Snow packed tight against entryways. Chimney caps iced over. Draft collapsed, and smoke had nowhere to go but back inside. Families were forced to choose between choking air and freezing cold. Some ran outside to clear chimneys in the dark. Others stayed in, eyes burning, fires smothered and relit again and again. At Barlow's place, the outer airlock door vanished under snow. The inner door did not care. Ben checked the seal once and left it alone. Wind could press all it wanted against steel. It still had another barrier to cross. The curved shell took the hit. Gusts struck, climbed the arc, and spilled upward instead of driving straight into the cabin's body. Snow tried to stack. The shape broke it apart, sending the drift sideways instead of letting it bite and hold. Inside, the chimney held draft. The double collar shed ice before it could thicken, keeping smoke moving out instead of forcing it back down. Ben stayed awake, not panicked, but alert. He listened for changes in sound, for vibrations that meant pressure was building where it should not. Nothing demanded a rush outside. Nothing forced him into the wind. Martha kept the children close, but calm. The room stayed warm enough to sit, to eat, to wait. The fire burned low and steady. It did not need feeding every hour. It was not fighting for its life. By morning, the storm had spent itself. The basin lay quiet under a reshaped blanket of snow. That was when Bruce Barlow arrived. He walked up from the road, face raw and reddened, beard stiff with ice. His eyes showed the fatigue of a night spent tending a fire that never quite won. Bruce's cabin was well built. Everyone said so. It always had been. But the draft had weakened overnight. Ice had narrowed the flue. The fire had smoked, sputtered, and demanded constant attention. The children there had not slept. Neither had he. Bruce stepped through the airlock and stopped. Not from shock, but from disbelief. The warmth was immediate, not heavy, not forced, just there. He saw the children eating a hot breakfast without coats. He saw Martha moving through the room, her shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. She met Ben's eyes across the table, a silent acknowledgement of a gamble that had paid off. No one hovered near the stove. No one listened for the fire to falter. Bruce did not mention hiding from winter. The words never came. Instead, he asked the only questions that mattered to him now. How wide is the gap? Where did you put the vents? How do you set the baffle when the wind turns? Ben answered simply, 18 inches, 5 vents, leeward open, windward tight. He opened the inner door and led Bruce into the narrow corridor between shell and cabin. The air there was cool, still, and dry. Ben pointed to the base of the curve where condensation had once formed, to the channel that caught it, to the drain that sent it outside. Bruce followed each detail with his eyes. No arguments left, no pride to defend. He stood there longer than he needed to, not embarrassed, just recalibrating. Outside, the storm's work was plain. Drifts piled against other houses. Chimneys stood, rimmed with ice. Inside the shell, winter had been reduced to weather, something to be endured, not fought. Bruce nodded once. Not an apology, something better. Learning. Nature had made its ruling, and it had done so with witnesses. After the storm, the name stayed, but the laughter did not. People still said, "Steel cocoon." Only now they said it the way men repeat something that worked. Harold Finch was the first to act on it. He helped 2 families build simple outer frames around existing cabins, leaving a narrow air gap and stretching canvas where steel was not available. Others used rough boards or salvaged planks. Nothing fancy, nothing uniform, just enough space to stop the wind before it reached the wall. They added small vents, high and low, simple baffles cut from scrap, set by feel and adjusted with the weather. The materials changed. The principle did not. Thomas Reed wrote a short technical note for the region. It avoided theory and stuck to one sentence that mattered. Stop the wind before it touches the structure. Barlow never advertised what he had built. He did not charge. He did not lecture. When someone asked, he showed them where the air stood still. When they did not ask, he said nothing. By the end of winter, the basin looked different. Not louder, not proud, just warmer, in the quiet way that good ideas spread when they do not need permission. The winter that followed looked different across Red Willow Basin. New cabins went up with narrow buffer spaces, angled sheds, or simple windscreens built from whatever men had on hand. No 2 looked the same. All of them shared one idea. Benjamin Barlow's Quonset-Covered cabin never became a landmark. It was not photographed, named, or pointed out to strangers. It was remembered because it stayed standing when the storm tried to erase it, because it held warmth when it mattered, without asking for credit. Barlow himself did not explain what he had done unless someone asked. Most days, he split wood, checked vents, and let the wind do what it would. Out on the slope, the gusts never stopped. They still tested roofs, doors, and judgment. That was the way the frontier had always worked. It did not reward tradition for its own sake. It buried stubbornness. It remembered what worked. On the frontier, stubbornness gets buried. What works gets remembered. If this story changed how you think about cold, shelter, or survival, leave a comment below. What is the worst storm you have ever lived through?